Night fell hard over the Pacific. Black water stretched to the horizon, broken only by the pale glow of a rising moon and the distant silhouette of Japanese warships cutting through the dark. Then, a low engine rumble. Not from a bomber squadron. Not from a Navy carrier strike. Just one aircraft. Inside the cockpit, sweat mixed with oil and gunpowder. The pilot's hands tightened around the controls as tracer fire clawed upward from the ships below. Machine guns opened. The sky exploded in orange streaks. Bullets tore across the deck of a Japanese transport ship. Fuel drums erupted, sailors scattered, and alarms screamed across the convoy. But this aircraft wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't approved by the military. It wasn't designed by an official engineer. It was built by one stubborn American mechanic who refused to follow the rules. A man the military tried to stop. A man the Japanese Navy would soon fear. His name was Pappy Gunn. And what he created in the jungles of the Pacific would turn ordinary transport planes into flying gunships. Weapons that could tear through entire fleets. This is the story of the illegal engineer who changed air warfare in World War I. In early 1942, the Pacific War looked grim. Japan had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. Within months, Imperial forces surged across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. American air power in the region was shattered. Airfields burned. Bombers were destroyed on the ground. Fighters were hopelessly outnumbered. And scattered across muddy jungle runways from Australia to New Guinea were the remnants of what was left. Old aircraft, shortages of weapons, and desperate crews trying to survive. Among them was a man who technically wasn't supposed to be there at all. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn wasn't a trained combat pilot when the war began. He wasn't a military engineer either. He was a former Navy mechanic, airline pilot, and aviation tinkerer who had spent years modifying aircraft for civilian use across Asia. When Japan invaded the Philippines, Gunn refused to evacuate quietly. Instead, he joined the American forces scrambling to defend the collapsing front lines. But Gunn quickly realized something terrifying. The planes available in the Pacific were not built for the kind of war they were facing. Japanese shipping convoys were everywhere. Troop transports, supply ships, fuel carriers, moving freely between captured islands. American bombers struggled to stop them. High-altitude bombing rarely hit moving ships. And slow torpedo runs were deadly. Japanese anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with steel. Pilots needed something different. Something faster. Something that could attack ships directly and survive the flak. Gunn stared at one aircraft in particular sitting uselessly on the runway. The Douglas A-20 Havoc. It was designed as a light bomber, but Gunn saw something else. He saw potential. The nose section normally held a bombardier and glass observation panels. But Gunn had a radical idea. Rip the glass out. Rip the bombardier station out. And fill the nose with machine guns. Not one. Not two. But an entire battery. It wasn't an official modification. It wasn't approved by the Army Air Forces. And it definitely wasn't in any engineering manual. But Gunn didn't care. In a makeshift jungle workshop, using scrap metal, salvaged gun mounts, and pure determination, he began transforming the aircraft. One gun became 4. 4 became 6. Eventually the modified A-20 carried 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. The result was something entirely new. A low-altitude strafing aircraft capable of ripping apart ships, airfields, and troop columns. And the first time it flew into combat, the Japanese had no idea what they were about to face. Because this wasn't a bomber. It was a flying machine gun platform. And it was about to rewrite the rules of Pacific warfare. By 1942, supply lines determined everything in the Pacific War. Japan relied on thousands of ships moving troops, fuel, ammunition, and aircraft between island bases. If those ships could be destroyed, entire garrisons would collapse. But attacking ships was incredibly dangerous. Bombers flying at 15,000 feet struggled to hit moving targets. Dive bombers required steep, risky approaches. Torpedo bombers had to fly low and slow, perfect targets for anti-aircraft fire. Pappy Gunn's modified A-20 offered a new solution. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, the aircraft would attack just above the waves. Pilots would race toward enemy ships at nearly 300 miles per hour, then unleash a storm of .50 caliber fire. The 8 machine guns in the nose could fire thousands of rounds per minute. At close range, the effect was devastating. Gunfire shredded anti-aircraft positions. Explosive rounds ignited fuel drums. Bridge crews were forced to abandon command stations. Then the aircraft would release bombs or skip bombs across the water, bouncing them directly into the sides of ships. This tactic became known as skip bombing, and it would revolutionize Pacific combat. The most famous example came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. Japanese forces attempted to send a massive convoy of troop transports toward New Guinea. 8 destroyers escorted the ships. Anti-aircraft guns covered every deck. Japanese commanders believed the convoy was safe. They expected American bombers to attack from high altitude, and attack their defenses were designed to stop. Instead, the American aircraft appeared at wave height. First came the B-25 Mitchells modified with forward-firing guns. Then the A-20 Havocs. Many of those modifications traced directly back to Pappy Gunn's original ideas. Pilots roared toward the convoy at terrifying speed. Japanese gunners opened fire. Flak bursts filled the sky. But the American aircraft kept coming. Machine guns erupted. Streams of tracer fire raked across the ships. Gun positions were smashed. Crewmen scattered. Then the bombs came, skipping across the water like stones, slamming directly into hulls, exploding beneath the decks. Within hours the Japanese convoy was destroyed. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers destroyed or crippled. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers lost at sea. The battle shocked Japanese commanders. They had never faced this kind of attack before. Aircraft flying so low they seemed to skim the waves. Machine guns firing non-stop. Bombs striking from impossible angles. To them it felt like being attacked by flying gunships. And in many ways, that's exactly what Gunn had created. His unofficial modifications spread quickly across the Pacific theater. Mechanics copied the gun-nose designs. Bombers were converted into strafing aircraft. Entire squadrons adopted the tactic. American pilots suddenly had a weapon perfectly suited for the chaotic island war. Supply convoys that once moved freely now faced deadly ambush from the sky. Fuel ships burned. Transports sank. Runways were shredded by gunfire before aircraft could even take off. Japanese troops began to fear a new sound. Not the high drone of bombers, but the sudden roar of engines at treetop height. Because when those aircraft appeared, the attack had already begun. And escape was almost impossible. As the Pacific War intensified through 1943 and 1944, the influence of Gunn's innovation spread far beyond a single aircraft. Squadrons operating from rough jungle airstrips in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines began adopting the same brutal attack profile. Low altitude, maximum speed, relentless gunfire. Pilots trained to approach enemy ships at barely 50 feet above the water, using the ocean surface to mask their approach from radar and visual observers. At that height, reaction time for enemy gunners was almost non-existent. By the time Japanese crews spotted the aircraft, it was already screaming toward them. The nose guns opened first. Streams of .50 caliber rounds smashed searchlights, shredded anti-aircraft crews, and tore across the decks of transports. Fuel tanks exploded. Communication lines snapped. Then came the bombs. Released at precisely the right moment so they skipped across the water like flat stones. A split second later, a thunderous explosion against the hull. Entire ships could be disabled in seconds. Japanese naval officers began issuing warnings across convoy routes. Expect low-level American attackers. Expect aircraft that did not behave like bombers. Expect attacks that came so fast they were nearly impossible to stop. For the pilots flying those missions, the experience was almost surreal. They could see the faces of sailors on the decks below. They could smell the burning fuel after each pass. And every time the guns fired, they knew they were flying a weapon that had started as nothing more than an unauthorized idea in a jungle hangar. An idea that had quietly reshaped the air war over the Pacific. In the final years of the Pacific War, American air power had transformed dramatically. What began as desperate improvisation on muddy jungle runways had evolved into a coordinated system of low-level strike tactics that crippled Japanese supply routes across thousands of miles of ocean. Convoys that once moved freely between island bases now traveled cautiously, often hugging coastlines or moving at night. Even then, the threat remained constant. Because the aircraft inspired by Gunn's modifications could appear almost anywhere. Flying low over jungle ridges. Skimming across open water. Striking suddenly with overwhelming firepower before disappearing back into the clouds. For the Allied pilots who flew those missions, the tactics developed in those early experimental days became a standard part of Pacific air warfare. And while many engineers and commanders contributed to refining these strategies, the spark that ignited the idea came from one unconventional thinker who refused to accept that existing aircraft were good enough. Pappy Gunn never set out to become a legend of aerial warfare. He simply looked at a problem and built a solution. But in doing so, he helped reshape how aircraft could fight at low altitude, proving that innovation in war doesn't always come from blueprints or committees. Sometimes it begins with a mechanic, a toolbox, and the courage to try something no one else believed would work. Pappy Gunn never designed aircraft in a factory. He didn't work in Washington. He worked in jungle workshops surrounded by oil drums, scrap metal, and half-destroyed planes. Yet his ideas changed how the war in the Pacific was fought. By turning bombers into gunships, Gunn gave American pilots the ability to strike enemy fleets with terrifying precision. Convoys that once moved confidently through the Pacific suddenly became targets. Ships burned. Supply lines collapsed. And the balance of air power slowly shifted. But Gunn's legacy wasn't just in the aircraft he modified. It was in the mindset he represented. Innovation under pressure. Improvisation in the face of defeat. The willingness to break rules when survival demanded it. Because sometimes the weapons that change history aren't built in massive factories. Sometimes they are built by one stubborn mechanic who refuses to accept defeat. And in the skies over the Pacific, that mechanic helped turn ordinary aircraft into the nightmare of the Japanese Navy. When historians look back at World War II aviation, they often focus on the famous machines. The heavy bombers that flattened cities. The sleek fighters that dominated the skies over Europe. But the Pacific War was different. It was fought across endless ocean, scattered islands, and remote jungle airstrips where resources were scarce and survival depended on improvisation. In that environment, innovation mattered as much as technology. And few people embodied that spirit more than Pappy Gunn. He didn't follow traditional engineering procedures. He didn't wait for approval from distant command offices. When he saw a problem, he grabbed tools and started building solutions. Sometimes those solutions looked crude. Sometimes they broke the rules. But again and again they worked. The gun-nose attack aircraft that emerged from Gunn's ideas would influence many later designs. The concept of heavily armed low-altitude strike aircraft would appear again in future conflicts, proving that Gunn's instincts had been far ahead of their time. More importantly, his work helped protect countless Allied pilots. Instead of slow, vulnerable bombing runs, they now had aircraft capable of fighting back with overwhelming firepower. That change saved lives. It also destroyed the shipping network that Japan depended on to sustain its far-flung empire. Convoys that once crossed the Pacific with confidence began traveling in fear, because somewhere above the horizon, an aircraft might suddenly appear at wave height. Engines roaring, guns blazing. A machine born not in a government laboratory, but in the mind of a mechanic who refused to accept defeat. And in the vast history of World War II, filled with massive battles and powerful leaders, the story of Pappy Gunn stands as proof that sometimes the course of war can change because one man looked at an ordinary airplane and imagined something far more dangerous.